Hello and welcome to Storytime 2. They called it a game. I've had a few drinks tonight. What do you expect? I'm a writer. We're historically highly imperfect. That's what makes us good at it. Anyways, tonight we're going to be reading parts 13 and 14 of They Called It a Game. If you're not caught up yet, go get caught up. I will be leaving links to every previous episode in the description. This is exceedingly difficult to do well because, yes, I'm a little tipsy. But I got that way after I drove safely home. As I was saying, if you like it, subscribe with that beautiful little red subscribe button, and then click that sad little gray bell to make sure you get notifications, because otherwise YouTube won't tell you when I put a new video out. It's ever so frustrating. And honestly, it's childish. You know, I mean, come on YouTube, grow up. So once again, spoiler alert, fair warning. We're going to be reading episodes 13 and 14 tonight. It took us over a month to recover from our losses against Forge, and our numbers never fully regrew. Those of us that were left simply carried on as best we could, watching over the weak and wounded at our camps and helping the families and children who had lost their loved ones grieve. We sorted the remainder of our units into varied divisions, led by the best of the best in Titan, directly, and trained relentlessly. What small numbers we had now would have to be used wisely. We recruited from the survivors of Forge's rampage through the Midwest and found a handful of men and women willing to put their lives on the line for their species. We were learning their strengths and putting them through the basics of training when we heard a terrible rumor coming out of California. I should make it clear at this point the communications weren't holding up as well as we would have hoped. Between the infrastructure being destroyed in an array of places and the people who knew the technology being stricken down by the monsters that roamed the countryside, things were patchy if they worked at all. And most of our viable communications were short range. However, according to what our scouts were able to report, people were being rounded up in droves and shuffled into camps. It was unclear what might be happening in the camps, but what wasn't unclear was that they were centered in hotbeds of enemy activity, and these locations had not been discussed among any known groups of survivors. We would have to break camp and make our way to California. However, traveling in the dead of winter would be out of the question for most of our numbers, so we decided to send a forward unit, headed by one of our finest stealth operatives, Morg. He was well known for uncovering even the best-kept secrets through his uncanny blend of creative interrogation and almost surgical use of his chained daggers. With him went a small band of scouts he had chosen by hand for their particular sets of skills. There was Soul, the healer, who, while ensuring your health never fell flat, spun a tapestry of jokes and wit that often did. Dill, the ranger who managed to keep his health hovering just above dead while dishing out an uncommon blend of potent ranged and melee attacks. And Uglia, a brash and unapologetic matriarch who cared deeply for her people and fought viciously for their safety. They set off in early January, as we began training for the older of the surviving children. Anyone who was at least 10 could start to learn. We had hoped that these children would never see combat. However, it had become clear when we made our way through that quiet ghost town on the march toward Forge that these children had been trained and ready. The children we saw in the town that day we faced off against Forge stand out to me as almost more terrifying than the beast himself. I remember the cold, dead eyes that gleamed out of the shadows over me. I remember the breathy laughter in the crowds that gathered upon us, their lumbering figures distorted and misshapen as they stared deep into each and every one of us. I cannot forget their shrill voices clamoring for our metals and stones, their hushed chants of more and want. Not pieced together, mind you, but faint and haunting words roaming lonesomely across the lips of each child in the heaving mass. There was no telling what had happened to these kids, whether they had been somehow corrupted by the new world, or if they had simply fallen victim to the madness provided by a totally barbaric society. It was clear that several of the people who had once lived in this town had begun a cult-like religion founded on the majesty of Forge. We knew they had provided materials for the beast to consume, and that they had even gone so far as to murder travelers for their metals and stones. What they had done to these children, though, none of us could know, or even imagine. They were clearly human at one point, but it seemed as though that was so long ago that it would be very hard to fathom. As their mouths stood open before us like the gaping maws of some treacherous monster, it was clear to see their sharpened teeth and split tongues writhing and drooling a bloodied spit. I didn't know if they were simply the product of that town or if this was a possibility for our own children. And I hoped I would never see anything like them again. In the days that followed the dispatch of Morg's party, while waiting for word on the Western Front, I worked closely with Lori and Dave to try to understand what had happened during the fight with Forge. We wanted to figure out why they had seemed so consumed and how they managed such unbelievable feats of raw power, but neither of them could remember much about their time under the effects of whatever had happened, other than being completely consumed by emotion. Emotions so powerful they didn't feel like they could be contained within themselves. They could only recall the actual blows they struck and absorbed. According to what they had to say, everything outside of the very moment they were in was a blur. It was almost like I felt like I was actually going to explode when I was wrapped up in that light. And when it happened, it was like this rush of power, and like I was perfectly calm the whole time, though I can clearly remember being just fucking filled with rage, like something I hadn't ever felt, and I had to cover my people, and suddenly I could. Dave told me in a recollection of the events. Yeah, it was kind of like that for me too, but not calm. I felt more like I was crazy focused, just honed in on every strike, and like time was slowed down around me, and I just remember being blinded with sorrow and rage all at once when they... Lori trailed off before she could finish her sentence. The sight of Adam being dragged away was hard for us all, but to her it was obviously something more. They had been together since they were teens, and at this point had spent more years as a pair than either had ever spent as a solo act. Not knowing what had happened was probably even more devastating than knowing for certain he had died. She would later go on to describe the mixed blend of hope and fear that was pervasive during this time. There are few things more deeply terrifying to me than not knowing. I don't know if I could have done what she had and kept going, and I respected her all the more for that strength of will. As we spent several days in training, trying to get these powers to emerge again, we received word from some East Coast allies we had left behind. My younger brother had gone missing, with a small cadre of his finest students, and no one had seen him for weeks. I would have been worried, but Corey was a special exception to your usual participant in these recent world changes. He had risen to unbelievable heights after the discovery of the magic mechanics, and had taken on dozens of students, quickly assembling an entire school of wizardry. I was confident he'd do well wherever he was. The more troubling news was of yet more people being rounded up around the small packs of skilled survivors. The word was that a small band of the Red had branched into the east. Other than those little tidbits, there was very little news, and we couldn't maintain communications well enough to pass on any of our own ideas about furthering the intelligence operations. It wasn't long before word started coming in from the south as well, and soon, just as much as we were dark on the western front, we were now under a blanket of mystery that surrounded us completely. It was all we could do to maintain our supplies into camp, while we tried desperately to ready our younger members to carry their own weight. As we progressed, gaining strength with each passing day, it seemed apparent that our challenges would continue to mount, and safe areas became increasingly scarce for people not at the top of their game. We became more and more of a social service than an army, caring for anyone who hadn't already abandoned hope for a decent life, and recruiting all that we could from their numbers. Forge had been a major victory, but those of us who had spent so much time in games before knew he would only be the start of an ever-increasing wealth of powerful threats. Getting these people ready wasn't just for them. It was a selfish act. None of us would survive if we didn't ensure that we could overcome the next threat, and it would certainly be greater than Forge. We needed to learn what these powers that sprang forth in our time of need were, and how to control them. But with word pouring in from every direction of a growing threat in the Red, our investigations could only go so far. We prepared to defend our encampments, and in 2 weeks' time, we finally got the first word from Morg and the Forward Scouts. That is They Called It a Game, episodes 13 and 14. I hope very much that you enjoyed it. Remember to tune in next time, probably tomorrow night, for episodes 15 and 16. The story just gets better and better as it goes on. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked it, make sure to subscribe, click that little gray bell to make sure you get all the notifications, and I'll see you in the very near future. But until then, take care.